welcome to today's D-Series webinar. For those that I haven't met yet, my name is Carly and I'm an Entrepreneurship Program Manager for the UCSF Rosenman Institute. Before I get to introducing our speaker today, I'd like to share with the entrepreneurs and the audience that are just getting started that we offer several pro bono services through our Startup Operations Support Resource Hub. This includes incorporation, registering with the FDA, and opening your business bank accounts. The applications are super fast and easy to complete, and you will get connected with one of our partners, usually within an hour and up to a couple of days. So please check that out and take advantage of these resources. The link is in the chat below. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Michael Beebe, who is joining us from Chicago. He is the co-founder and partner at ADVI. Michael leads ADVI's device and diagnostics business lines, focusing on coding, payment, and coverage strategies. He has over 26 years of experience in the healthcare industry and is a reimbursement and coding specialist. Michael spent 14 years at the American Medical Association, where he was most recently Director of Current Procedural Terminology, CPT. Today, Michael will walk you through the processes and requirements of the CPT Editorial Panel with a focus on problems encountered by new technologies. He will be taking your questions throughout the presentation, so please share any questions you have in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Michael.
Great. Thank you, Carly. I appreciate it. And thank you for having me. I think CPT is a very important topic for innovators in healthcare. It is definitely a choke point, I think, gateway for new technologies, and can enable the success of them or cause problems potentially. So I think what I'm going to do today is talk about the process and then talk about challenges that frequently crop up for new technologies as part of that process. So let me get my share my screen here. All right, so just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. Talk about the CPT Editorial Panel, the process, timelines, the criteria, Category 1 codes, Category 3 codes, and then within each of those sections, talk about challenges for new technology. So first of all, the CPT code set is owned and copyrighted by the American Medical Association. It's maintained by the CPT Editorial Panel. The panel itself is nominated by specialty societies, American Hospital Association, non-physician healthcare professionals, but they are all appointed by the AMA Board of Trustees. So this CPT is very much an artifact of the American Medical Association. As a result of HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, all financial institutions are required, or excuse me, healthcare institutions are required to use CPT for financial transactions. So CPT is required to be used for all claim forms. The AMA does recognize how influential CPT is for reimbursement for physicians, for hospitals, and the role CPT plays for new technologies. So they're mindful of it, and so there are rules to guard against conflicts of interest. There's established criteria and evidence standards for obtaining new CPT codes, and then there are processes that are open and relatively transparent. There's an online application, and I provide the link to it here. There's also a great deal of information about how to complete the application. So the AMA has also been receptive, I think, to industry groups such as the Medical Device Manufacturers Association and AVIMED to look at changes to refine and improve the CPT process. They eliminated the requirement for only US publications, and then they also eliminated the requirement for having US patients in clinical studies. They developed guidelines for the medical specialty society coding and reimbursement committees that those societies need to follow. And then the AMA also put a medical device industry representative on the CPT Editorial Panel. And so while I think the AMA has been responsive, there are still challenges, particularly for new technologies. So the CPT process itself, it's important to note that anybody can submit a CPT code change proposal or code application. It does not need to be a physician, does not need to be from a medical specialty society or an institution. It can come from anybody. So that proposal, once it's submitted electronically through the online app, it goes to the AMA staff, and the AMA staff will review it, make sure it's complete, help answer any problems that the applicant may have had. And then once that application is deemed to be complete, they'll put it on a secure AMA internet site where the CPT Advisory Committee has access to it. So the CPT Advisory Committee are all the specialty societies that are in the AMA House of Delegates, and then also all the non-physician healthcare professionals who need to use the CPT code set to send and receive healthcare information, basically to comply with HIPAA. So there's about 128, 130 different CPT advisors, and their role is to review the application, make sure the language is consistent with CPT terminology. The terms are consistent with terminology that's used in the specialty society, but they also review the criteria to make sure that the application is consistent with the criteria that are established. And I'll be talking about that criteria in a little bit. So the advisors have the ability to comment on the application, and those comments are then transmitted to the CPT Editorial Panel. The CPT Editorial Panel itself has complete control over the CPT code set. They decide what new codes are added, what codes are deleted, any revised language in the code set. So they have complete control over the CPT. For Category 1 codes, once those codes are established by CPT, they go to a sister process called the RUC process. And I'm not getting into the RUC process too much today. It probably demands its own presentation. So Christine and Carly, I'm happy to come back and do one on the RUC if you like. But I think that's probably a whole nother can of worms. There is a appeal process if you're dissatisfied with the decision of the editorial panel, and the appeals are run by the CPT Executive Committee. So they hear appeals, and then they'll make recommendations back to the CPT Editorial Panel. So deliberations on CPT code change proposals occur at the editorial panel meetings, and there are 3 meetings that take place a year. So there's a meeting usually in late September, early October. There's another meeting in February, and then there's the final meeting of the CPT Editorial Panel in May of each year. Applications for code changes need to be submitted 3 months in advance of that editorial panel meeting. And it's very, very important. I'll go into more detail on this later, but it's very important to pay attention to the CPT calendar, because February is actually the first meeting of a CPT cycle. And what I mean by CPT cycle, it's the new, the CPT book, if you will, for 2023, 2024, 2025. That's what I mean by cycle. That also corresponds with the Medicare physician fee schedule of that same year. So February is the first meeting. February of 23, as the slide notes here, is the first meeting for CPT 2025. So it's quite far in advance. And so it really pays to, look forward and look in advance. The editorial panel meetings themselves, agendas for the meeting are posted 1 month in advance. So you can go on the AMA website in the CPT section and look to see what is being considered at the editorial panel. You can do that it'll probably be in late December or maybe early January for the February CPT meeting. There is an interested party process where if there's an item on the agenda that you feel is relevant to what you're working on, you can send the AMA an email, engage in that interested party process, and they'll send you the application. And you have an opportunity to review the application, and then you also have an opportunity to comment. Panel actions following a panel meeting are posted online about a month after the panel meeting. And this is top line information only. It doesn't get into the nitty gritty of, code numbers or code descriptors or anything like that. This is just, a new code was developed for, coronary catheterization or something. Panel votes are secret to maintain confidentiality. And all new codes are really not released until October. So you don't really have a true understanding of all the new codes in the CPT code set until the new book comes out, the new data file comes out in October. The physician fee schedule, the proposed rule that CMS issues, frequently they'll have a decent amount of information on new codes, but they don't use the actual code number. There's no information about guideline language associated with those codes or anything like that. You really need to wait until the full code set comes out in October of every year. The code set that comes out in October is then it's implemented and eligible for use in January. So codes come out this October, you can start to use those January 1st of 2023. So here's the CPT timeline, and you can see here. Let's look at this middle row here, and this is the upcoming meeting in February. So code change proposals are due in November 2nd for that. The meeting will be, agenda items will be posted to the AMA website in December. Interested stakeholder requests will be due January 12th to the AMA. And then if you're a stakeholder and you want to develop a comment, those will be due January 19th. The actual meeting is February 2 through 4. And then the summary of panel actions will come out on or about March 3rd. So if you're interested in applying, you obviously need to get to work. November is coming up very quickly. You need to make sure that you adhere to these deadlines because you don't really get any slack at all because one process rolls into the next process. As I noted, CPT rolls into RUC, and then the next CPT process will then roll into the next RUC process, all of which build for the physician fee schedule. So there's very little wiggle room in this. You need to cooperate with requests from AMA staff. And if you submit an application, very likely they're going to have questions for you on that application. So you need to be able to spend some time with staff resolving any of the questions that they have. And then, of course, you need to comply with the CPT lobbying policy, which is after you submit the application, you cannot reach out to anybody proactively. If the AMA reaches out to you, that's fine. Or if the specialty society reaches out to you, that's fine. But you cannot proactively reach out to anybody else. And in fact, the specialty society probably should go through the AMA just to make sure that there's no potential for being accused of lobbying or anything like that. Go on to the next slide here. So I've got a question here about the RUC and what does the RUC stand for? It's an acronym within an acronym. It's the AMA/Specialty Society RVS Update Committee. And it's a group at the AMA that makes recommendations to CMS on physician payment for new and revised CPT codes. Another question I just got is that, are there application fees? And no, there are no application fees. So let's talk a little bit about challenges associated with just this process calendar in and of itself. So as I mentioned, there's very little wiggle room in this, right? So coding changes intersect with the RUC valuation process and their schedule, and then also the CMS schedule for the physician fee schedule. And there's a proposed rule process, and the proposed rule comes out in July, usually the first week in July, nicely timed around July 4th holiday. And then the final rule comes out first week in November, nicely timed around Thanksgiving, around Halloween. So there's very little wiggle room in the process. There are 3 meetings a year. And the last meeting, this meeting in September, was for 2024. And then the meeting in February, as I noted, is for the 2025 CPT. So there's, these meetings are 14 to 15 months ahead of the CPT version and the CPT and the Medicare physician fee schedule. So this provides very little ability to time around FDA clearance or FDA approval with, actual market entry around obtaining a CPT code and the, ability to use that code on January 1st of any given year. It also causes a lot of problems for timing of publications. And then the 30-month delay for a category 1 code is a real risk. So if you didn't get a code in September and you're forced back to the February meeting, that's putting you off a whole year. So that's something you need to account for in your planning. And again, the CPT applications are due 3 months ahead of time. This provides a very narrow window to work with medical specialty societies, and I highly advise that to be sure that you work with medical specialty societies who are likely to be the users of the technology, the procedure, the service that you're working in. And again, timing of publications can be difficult. So there's some options for dealing with this, these tight deadlines and extended deadlines. So for the last meeting in the cycle, the panel is willing to approve a new code if all the criteria are met, if all the publications are met, all the utilization is met, and it's really just contingent on FDA approval. As you can imagine, it's pretty difficult to achieve utilization if you don't have FDA approval, but this sometimes happens. And so contingent on FDA approval means the AMA will say, all right, we're going to adopt this new category 1 code, but we need to see, the FDA letter by, such and such date. This has happened several times in the past. I think the last time I was aware of it, I think it was for TAVR, transcatheter aortic valve implantation, and the transfemoral approach and the transapical approach were both approved by the panel, but the transapical approach was delayed at FDA, so that had to be the panel action had to be rescinded and the category 3 code installed for that. So it's something to think about. It's unusual, but it's something to consider. Another important element here is that even though the deadline for the application is 3 months ahead of time, you are able to put in a manuscript that's been submitted for publication, but not yet published. You can put that manuscript in your application, and then if that manuscript is accepted for publication at least 30 days ahead of the panel meeting, you can provide that information to the AMA. You're not otherwise allowed to update an application at all after that initial submission, except for this kind of disposition that the AMA allows to get articles published. So this slide, it's rather busy, and you'll get copies of these slides. But these are the general criteria for either category 1 or category 3 codes. So first of all, the code descriptor needs to be unique, well-defined, describes a procedure or service which clearly identified and distinguished from other codes in the CPT code set. And so that obviously requires some knowledge of the CPT code set and where your product is going to fit, and whether there's anything else that might cover it. Descriptor structure, guidelines, instructions need to be consistent with the CPT standards and requirements for the code set. The descriptor is not a fragmentation of existing codes. It does not describe a more difficult procedure or an unusual procedure in any way. And the descriptor is not proposed as a means to report, extraordinary circumstances, or anything like that. And then also, very importantly, for category 1 CPT codes, all devices, drugs necessary to provide the service need to be cleared or approved by the FDA. The procedure or service is performed by many physicians or qualified healthcare professionals in the United States, and we'll talk more about that. The procedure or service is performed with frequency consistent with the intended clinical use. So if it's a service that is for a common condition, you would think it should have a high volume. The procedure or service is consistent with current medical practice, and the clinical efficacy of the procedure or service is documented in peer-reviewed published literature that meets requirements set forth in the application. And I'll talk about the literature requirements. So these are the criteria for Category 3 codes, and Category 3 are for new and emerging technologies, and the bar is lower for these purposefully. So the procedure or service for Category 3 needs to be performed in humans, and then at least one of the 3 following criteria needs to be met. It needs to be supported by a specialty society, or the actual or potential clinical efficacy needs to be established in a peer-reviewed published study. So maybe an early, first in human study, as they call them. And then third, there needs to be at least an institutional review board approval or protocol on clinicaltrials.gov. So these are the Category 3 criteria that are in addition to the regular criteria. It doesn't mean that you can develop a CPT code for an extraordinary service that might overlap with something else. You still need to follow those, but these are the additional criteria for Category 3. So I got a question here about how, if at all, does an FDA cleared indication for use relate to the CPT code? Can a code be specific for something that is not part of your FDA label? It's an excellent question. It does not really have an easy answer. The FDA clearance or approval is required, and you do need to provide the FDA letter. And you definitely need to be within your label. If you're going very far outside your label for FDA, potentially it could be okay with the editorial panel, strangely enough. They only require FDA approval. They don't require, that specifically align with the CPT code. And CPT is willing to create codes for off-label use. There is, however, an evidence burden, and you'll need to meet CPT evidence criteria that we'll talk about here in a little bit. You also need to meet the utilization criteria that I just went through in a fairly high level. So there's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence with the indication, but there's lots of other criteria that you need to meet. Another question I got is there any panel or body or organization to offer an evaluation of whether a device or service meets an existing Category 3 code or presumably a Category 1 code as well, and before a company applies for a new one. So there's no official body. If there is an official body, it would be the American Medical Association itself, and there is an online question knowledge base, CPT knowledge base, and CPT inquiry system that you can sign up for. If you're not a physician and you're not an AMA member, there is a fee for it, but you can ask questions via that site. Also, the specialty societies are frequently, I shouldn't say frequently, occasionally willing to work with you to understand whether or not an existing CPT code would fit. But then there's also consultants like myself who do that for a living as part of what we do. We'll evaluate that, and then if necessary, we'll take it to the specialty societies and to the AMA as well. But it's I wouldn't say it's a formal process. The AMA is probably the most formal, but it's really more of an informal process. Another question I got is, what is the benefit of a Category 3 code? How can it be used to eventually obtain a Category 1 code? Excellent question. And I'll be going into Category 3 codes in more detail and how they can be used. But generally speaking, the CPT Editorial Panel does, and specialty societies do favor Category 3 codes. It's really an opportunity to begin an engagement with the CPT process, to begin an engagement with the specialty societies, to figure out the language of your code, how it interacts with other codes in the CPT code set, and then it also can help facilitate data collection. So for new technologies, I strongly recommend considering obtaining a CPT Category 3 code before they're out of the FDA, since that is perfectly fine for Category 3 codes, since all they require is a research protocol, a published study, or specialty society or specialty society acceptance. So I highly recommend that. So let's talk a little bit about challenges associated with fitting into the CPT code set. So this really does require an in-depth knowledge of the CPT code set and how the new technology relates to that. And so companies are not, they're not experts on CPT, right? They're experts on whatever their chosen field is. So it's important to develop that expertise or to contract to obtain that expertise or work with a specialty society on that level of expertise. But there can be several different ways to approach a new CPT code, and it's some of them matter more than others. There are sometimes this type of CPT code you get can significantly affect payment, both hospital payment and physician payment. And I just got a follow-up question on Category 3 codes. Category 3 codes do not go through the RUC process. Category 3 codes are not valued on the physician fee schedule, but you can negotiate coverage and payment for Category 3 codes with Medicare contractors. And while that is a difficult process, it is achievable. But there's no national payment amount for Category 3 codes. So to get back into the challenges associated with fitting into CPT, it's been my experience that disruptive and novel technologies often have difficulty fitting into CPT coding boxes, and they need to be approached, from a novel standpoint. Technologies with little physician work and primarily practice expense also struggle with CPT. They need to be approached differently. It's important to recognize that E&M codes or office visit codes can cover a very broad range of non-procedural cognitive services. And then there's other cognitive services out there as well, like the comprehensive care codes. And there's other codes as well that potentially could cover a broad range of cognitive services. And then there are coding conventions in CPT like add-on codes that you need to understand, and add-on codes, can cause a great deal of problems for payment in the OPPS, the Medicare outpatient prospective payment system. And so, one of my recommendations here, as I said earlier, is to obtain Category 3 code while still undergoing FDA approval or clearance. So you're not ready to be on the market, but you can start to engage with specialty societies, start to engage with the CPT Editorial Panel around the language of your code, and start to think about how it's going to fit in a meaningful way, because you're getting a code and you're sitting in front of the panel, but it's not as meaningful as if you're trying to go immediately for a Category 1 code that's priced on the fee schedule, and the bar is much higher for that. So this is just an example. I pulled a fairly random page out of the CPT book. And so you can see here that there's conventions, right? So you can see this is right here, these codes are known as indented. These are known as indented codes, or a code family, where they follow the indents. And so these codes are related to one another, and they pick up where the semicolon is in the code above, and everything to the left of the semicolon is inherited down. So that's a CPT convention that you need to be aware of. This plus sign identifies an add-on code. That's another CPT and payment convention that you need to be aware of too. And it always has this type of language that says, lists separately in addition to the code for the primary procedure. And then frequently, as you can see up here, they have parenthetics that tell you which codes that can be reported with. So a word of caution here. Do not try to fit a new technology into an existing CPT code without extensive research and with the opinion of the relevant specialty societies and potentially the AMA. I've seen this backfire magnificently for many different technologies where you just assume that you can use a code. Do not assume that. Make sure that that code is the right code for your technology. And vet that with a consultant, a lawyer, specialty societies, the American Medical Association before going to market. Code language matters. You need to consider, what is the approach of your technology? Is it open, laparoscopic, endoscopic, percutaneous? What type of guidance is being used? So all that is very important and very much matters for CPT. Also, physician work matters. There are procedure descriptions from the RUC, pre, intra, post-service descriptions, and I think it's important to review those descriptions to understand how consistent those are going to be with your technology. So I'm getting some very specific questions that I really can't, technology or product specific questions I really can't, I can't go into on this more general presentation. I'd be happy to talk afterwards, or maybe Christine could, or Carly could set up a call. But I need to stick at, I think, at a fairly high level here. I apologize to anybody. So let's talk about some challenges associated with Category 3 codes, and there are plenty. As I said before, I would recommend applying while you're still undergoing FDA approval. Frequently, code change proposals for CPT Category 1 codes that do not meet the panel's criteria, do not meet either clinical evidence criteria or utilization criteria, either physician utilization or in terms of patients who have received the service or procedure, they're very likely to receive a Category 3 code. And that receiving that Category 3 code, once you're out of the FDA and you're more in a mindset of selling and of getting onto the market, that Category 3 code can cause lots of problems at that point. So, for example, any clinical studies that you presented as part of your Category 1 application, those clinical studies, in a sense, are already used. Right, so you're going to have to go back and think of, start to develop some additional clinical studies to substantiate your Category 1 application if those clinical studies were used on a Category 3 application. So that's something to think about. The panel and the specialty societies like to use Category 3 codes a great deal because they believe that it helps them understand the technology, how it impacts and interacts with the rest of the code set, prior to giving them a Category 1 code. So Category 3 codes after FDA clearance, as I said, the FDA trial, if that trial's been published, it's basically wasted. It's unfortunate. So you're going to need to think about new studies in order to convert to Category 1. Category 3 codes get almost immediate non-coverage by public and private payers. You can negotiate. You can show them the payer's clinical evidence to work with them to negotiate for coverage, but it's a challenge. A Category 3 code before FDA approval would allow you to use the FDA trial results to help meet CPT literature requirements. And they're also, with the Category 3 code before the FDA, you're already involved with the process. And so the panel, the specialty societies have had some exposure to the technology. They're more familiar with it, and that can help ease your transition into Category 1. We've got several questions here. So one, do private payers pay for Category 3 codes? Private payers can pay for Category 3 codes, but it's a difficult process. It's, in my experience, it's actually more difficult than getting Medicare, the Medicare administrative contractors or the MACs, to get them to pay for it. But it is possible, and there are examples of where Category 3 codes are being paid, but it's a struggle. So question I just got about clarifying about why the same FDA trial studies can't be used for Category 3 and Category 1 applications. It's not that they can't be used. You'd certainly want that trial to be put on your Category 1 application as well. It's just that with Category 1, the panel is going to expect additional clinical studies because the panel uses the clinical evidence criteria not only as a marker of safety, effectiveness, and patient outcomes, but they also use the number of clinical studies kind of as a soft point for widespread use. And so they believe that the more studies that are out there, the more widespread the technology. So just having, one FDA study and maybe, one or two studies before the FDA is really not sufficient for CPT. So let's talk a little bit about this utilization issue. As you noted, likely in my earlier slide, CPT does not do a very good job of defining what is required for widespread use. They say for widespread use has to be used by many physicians in the United States. And then they say for patient, in terms of patients who've experienced the technology, they say it's a reflection of the disease burden, and it's a common disease. They want to see more utilization. If it's a rare disease, they're willing to see less. But obviously, utilization is a major chicken and egg issue. How do you get a CPT code? How do you get the CPT code if you don't have utilization? How do you get utilization, without having a code? It's unreasonable to ask a physician or a hospital to take a loss in order to meet your utilization requirements. So this is one of the more difficult issues, and we've had the Medical Device Manufacturers Association, MDMA, has been engaged with the AMA on this issue for a couple of years, trying to develop, better criteria. But it's difficult. They don't want to set a hard line because they're dealing with so many technologies and so many, sort of different services and procedures that one line might not be appropriate for everything. So it's a challenge. But I try to break it down. So I look at, physicians who are trained and experienced in using the technology. And so a lot of this has to do with the ability to complete a RUC survey. So part of the RUC process for developing relative values is they survey physicians who have performed the procedure, used the technology. And they need to have at least 30 physician respondents. And they usually get about a 10% response rate. So you can do the math about how many physicians that, theoretically a specialty society or the CPT editorial panel might want to see. Service or procedures performed only in the US. They're only counting US procedures. They're not counting OUS procedures. But they are willing to accept company sales data as an indication. And so if you have a disposable supply, that's a one-to-one indication of the number of patients who've had the technology. That's an excellent marker of the utilization. If you don't, the panel is also generally willing to accept, install base. So for example, a new imaging or new AI technology that uses imaging, they're willing to accept the number of hospitals that have adopted it and have installed that AI on their systems and are, actively using it. That has become a little bit controversial. I shouldn't say controversial. There's become a little bit of a question in that regard, because they want to know not just that it's installed on a CT machine or an MR machine, for example, but that it's actually being used in clinical care. So some indication that it's not, that it is being used and is not just, kind of sitting there, not being used at all. So some options or recommendations I have here is to develop a strong physician training program if your technology involves a new procedure. Also to consider a post-approval data registry that might get you another clinical study. It will also get you more physicians and more patients to meet the utilization criteria. We're going to have a couple questions here on clinical studies, and I'll be talking about the clinical study requirements here in just a minute. Might be coming up actually. All right, not quite yet. So another challenge is working with the specialty society. And I had a question that alluded to this earlier. So specialty societies have a key role in the CPT editorial panel process. Specialty society support is officially not required, but it's almost impossible to get a code with specialty society opposition. You might be able to get a code if the specialty society is quiet, But you really want to have that specialty society on your side if you can. The panel views specialty societies as representing practicing physicians who would provide the service or procedure to patients. And forceful specialty support can overcome deficiencies. So if a specialty society is saying, yes, there are enough physicians to do a RUC application, to do a RUC survey, or yes, there are, this is installed in 1,000 hospitals and they are using them in, they're using the technology in clinical practice. The specialty society support is very important. However, specialties frequently have their own interests. They have concerns about scope of practice. They have concerns about protecting the pricing of existing procedures on the fee schedule. And they want to preserve their credibility with the panel. So frequently they're more interested in the codes that they currently have than in new technologies and new ways to care for patients and treat disease than they are, in their than they are with dealing with the new technology. So some of these priorities involve the RUC process, and they're constantly doing new surveys as part of the RUC process. And I'll talk about this a little bit later on, where the RUC and CMS require constant monitoring of the fee schedule. And so the specialties are always going back to CMS and back to the RUC and resurveying existing codes. Sometimes they don't want to work with industry. Some specialties view working with industry as a potential conflict, and that can make things difficult. So my recommendation here is to introduce the technology to the specialties as early as possible, preferably using your own medical director or physician champions that you've worked with. Have them introduce the technology to a specialty society. Allow the specialty society time to understand it, get used to it, see how it works, give them time to review the clinical evidence, and definitely do not rush them. So they really need a lot of time to work through the issues. So now we're going to get into the Category 1, Category 3 literature requirements for CPT. So each of these literature items must be submitted to the AMA. They need to have a PDF of the published peer-reviewed journal item, and you need to fill, as part of the application, you need to fill out. There's a grid in the application, and there's items that you need to fill out in the grid. So these are the criteria here on screen now that you can see where you need to fill out the grid. So you need to identify the level of evidence, and I'll be talking about the level of evidence in the later slide. You need to identify if it's a US-based journal or non-US journal. They don't care, but they still want that information. You need to identify the number of patients studied, indicate whether it's a prospective study. You provide a very short relevance statement about why this is important, why this study shows clinical efficacy, why it shows safety and patient outcomes, and really the elements that you care about. You provide up to 5 references. And so it's really a quality issue. It's not a quantity issue. So of the 5, at least 2 of the studies need to report different patient populations in addition to having different authors. So this can be a big problem, particularly for new technologies that are just getting started. A lot of times you use the same investigators, and that can cause problems for meeting this criteria. You really want to put forward your best, most well-designed studies for this purpose. And then also, if you're in a multi-code family, and you remember I showed you those multi-code families before with add-on codes and indented codes. So if you're having, a main code plus an add-on code, you need to have evidence for those add-on codes as well. So for example, if you're in the spine and it's, a main code for one level in lumbar, and then you also can do multiple other levels in lumbar, you need to have evidence to show that you can do, 2 or 3 additional levels of the technology as well, for example. So these are the level of evidence, and this is, as you can see here, it's from it's from Oxford, and it was vetted pretty extensively with AMA. And the AMA does require level of evidence from at least 2B in order to be eligible for a CPT Category 1 code. This is the another part of the application that helps to explain the literature. And so you can see here what type of technology you're dealing with. So if it's a typical technology, or they also have special dispensations they allow for limited specialized humanitarian use. And then there's also whether it's new or existing, they call it non-contributory. That's a little pejorative. But basically it's PMA and de novo versus 510K, and there's different requirements for that. This is the publication details attributes grid that I mentioned before that's in the application, and you can see these are all the fields that I just discussed earlier. I didn't mention this impact factor. This is the journal impact factor, and this is, they've not done anything with this, and to me it's a little worrisome, but you know, there's some thoughts on the part of the panel that they might try to use the impact factor to try and gauge the significance of a study, but they haven't done anything with it so far, which I think is just fantastic because they really haven't figured it out. It's fine with me. So an important caveat that's in the code application is that, you know, literature requirements set forth, you know, define the minimum requirements for the CPT editorial panel. And the panel members review the literature provided. Each member makes their own independent evaluation of the literature. Then the biggest caveat of all is that even though you meet the minimum literature requirements, does not guarantee that the panel will determine that the device is safe, effective, and has been determined to meet Category 1 CPT criteria. So there are other criteria as well that we've talked about, utilization, for example, that you need to approve, that you need to pass also. And they're just kind of giving you a warning here that even if you have good studies, you might not meet all the criteria. So let's talk about some of the challenges associated with clinical evidence. Well, one big area is the idea of durability. So you might, and this goes back to having, studies on different patient populations. So you might want to bring, follow that same patient population for, 12 months or 18 months, do another follow-up study to show durability. That's great, and it's very important for coverage. But as far as the panel is concerned, that's the same study. So you don't get extra credit for that study. The levels of evidence, the panel has tried, they've tried to define them better, but they're really not well understood by the CPT editorial panel, and they're interpreted differently and applied differently by panel members. Also, right under that, specialties often have different criteria. And this goes back to, I think, my first or second slide. The AMA did develop guidelines for specialty societies to participate in this process. One of them is that they need to follow the rules and requirements of the process. That doesn't always work out the way they intended, and sometimes they do develop their own criteria for clinical evidence. It's frequently, a higher bar, obviously, than what the panel wants to see. And then you also need to remember that payer coverage requirements are frequently higher than even CPT coverage requirements. And that's something to be mindful for, with respect to the whole issue of reimbursement. It's not just about coding, but you also have to consider what you need to do for coverage. I'm going to get into the RUC process here in just a little bit in order to provide some context for what the blowback is that from the RUC process that can affect CPT. So one of the issues that specialty societies are dealing with is that the RUC will require specialty societies to resurvey code families. So remember I mentioned before where you see indented codes, that's considered a code family. And then there's even broader code families. In the book, there are sections and subsections of codes in the book. So if you look at where your code is being placed, and if your new code is placed among codes that have not been surveyed for many years, or even as recently as 3 years potentially, you might need to have that whole family resurveyed. And that causes a great deal of problems for the specialty societies. They don't want, the value of existing codes to go down, and this raises that potential. So the idea of resurveying old codes can create some back pressure from specialties to support new technology. And I mentioned also that there are screens, and they're called overvalued code screens that CMS and the RUC do to identify CPT codes that are potentially overvalued. And if identified as potentially overvalued using these statistical utilization screens, they have to be brought back for resurvey. So specialty societies are constantly in the process of defending existing codes, the value of existing codes, potentially resurveying existing codes. And so this whole process of, the overvalued screen keeps specialty societies very busy, and it doesn't provide them with much bandwidth and can cause problems for CPT. So just to go through what I see as the steps for success in the CPT process. Plan ahead, start very early, work with the specialty societies early, consider the clinical evidence and clinical use with the specialty societies, what their criteria are, where their bar is, and work with them to meet it. Develop evidence for coding and coverage, not just to get through FDA. So as you're thinking about your FDA trial, think beyond FDA, think about CPT, and then also think about coverage. And then also, and talked about this extensively, consider obtaining a Category 3 code while you're still at the FDA. So there are some solutions that, as I mentioned, AMA and ADVI have discussed periodically on and off with the AMA of how to address some of these issues. I think we're down to the point of getting at some more difficult or tricky issues. So the idea that CPT applicants should be able to withdraw an application and use an unlisted code instead of having a Category 3 code forced on them. I think we've actually had a lot of success with this. It used to be that if you brought a Category 1 proposal forward and the editorial panel was recommending Category 3, you had to take that Category 3. You couldn't withdraw your application. The way it is now, they give you plenty of warning that if you go to the panel and you try to present live to the panel, you're likely to get a Category 3 code. So you need to be prepared for that and have discussions with the AMA in advance if that looks like that's happening, to avoid that happening if you don't want that to happen. I also think that there is room to clarify the utilization requirements. This is a difficult issue, but I think it's an issue that is needed because the utilization requirements is probably the most difficult issue that new technologies deal with right now. There's no good guidelines, and I think there's going to be continued discussion between, the AdvaMed, MDMA, and the AMA on this issues. And then there's also, for example, for new technologies, can there be a 3-year phase-in period where you do not resurvey the whole family of codes for 3 years, and you allow better understanding of how the new code is going to be used with respect to other codes in the family before you resurvey the whole family. And I think that 3-year buffer would provide some, consolation to the specialty societies and maybe make them not quite so anxious. So I think I'm just about out of time. Let me see if I can talk to some more questions here. How does breakthrough device designation affect reimbursement? Well, I won't discuss that with respect to reimbursement because reimbursement really involves coding, it involves coverage, and it involves payment. It involves all three of those things. But I will talk about it with respect to CPT, and the breakthrough device designation does not affect CPT at all. And in fact, I think the CPT chair once has a quote that we don't care about breakthrough designation, something to that effect. And it's not unreasonable because it doesn't have anything to do with requirements for a CPT code. Can you further describe overlapping patient populations? Does this mean different racial population ages, etc.? No, they're really referring to to the population in the study, the patients who are studied in that. So if you go back and follow them to understand durability, that is not an additional study. That is the same study. That's really what they're referring to. They're not referring to different racial groups or age groups or anything like that. So another question for category 1 applications, are we required to submit 5 papers, or is that the maximum number of submissions? 5 is the maximum number. You can submit less than that. And I've seen technologies get away with less than that, but they're generally, technologies that have, thousands of patients, like the TAVR valve. I gave an example of that earlier. That had, thousands of patients in a randomized controlled trial. So it's unusual that you have that robust of a type of a study, and so usually 5 is about what people go for. I think that's about it. I think I answered most of the questions. And as I said, this is being recorded, and I can make the presentation available for anybody who wants to look at it. So thanks for having me. Good talking to you guys.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thanks to everybody for attending. We have another webinar next week on Tuesday, and we hope to see you all there. We'll have Nicole Cannon going over EQMS. So hopefully you all will join us for that, and please register ahead of time, just like you did here. And again, thank you, Michael. It sounds like we might have you back for a second webinar in the future.
Glad to do it. All right. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.